What do you think of when I say the word posh? Do you think of a fancy hotel, or do you think of someone like Emma Watson or the King of England who and the way they talk? Or maybe you think of Victoria Beckham. Well, whatever you think of, on today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet, we're going to delve into the mysterious history of posh, whose origins are not so clear, but are very interesting nonetheless. And we are going to ask the cards how to live life a little posher. I'm John Paulus. You're listening to Life's Potluck Buffet only on YouTube. If you've been enjoying Life's Potluck Buffet, please subscribe. If you've already subscribed, thank you so much for your support. And thank you to everyone for listening. Okay, let's think of posh. But what did you think of? Being from the United States, my mind first goes to the fancy hotel. Maybe this hotel is in London, because there's also, obviously, posh has a British vibe to it. You don't tend to use it that often in many dialects of U.S. American English. I imagine that the people in this fancy hotel have posh accents. That's the second place I go, because I feel like, and I don't know, if you're from the UK, let me know in the comments if the accent thing comes first when you think of posh, or if you think of something else. But in American English, we have a word that the people who speak, the people from the UK, have translated posh into American English for a fairly long time. Well, the posh word isn't that old, so by a long time I mean 100 years at most. But they translated it into the American word highfalutin, which is actually the way the Webster's dictionary defines posh. One of the ways. Webster's dictionary, which is, for those of you listening who are not in the U.S., which is a kind of standard U.S. American English dictionary, defines posh as elegant or fashionable. It gives the example of a posh restaurant, but then it defines it as British, typical or intended for the upper classes, highfalutin. Oh, and it gives the example, posh accents. Right. Okay, there you go. So at least Webster's dictionary thinks that the British English speakers think of posh accents first. The highfalutin sounds just funny to me. I don't know if anybody else out there in the United States thinks that that's kind of a weird way to translate posh, because the highfalutin to me is just too fun of a word to accurately define posh in American English. We don't tend to have these sets of posh accents. If you asked a person from any region of the United States of America what is a posh accent, they'd probably tell you, some kind of British accent. That's a posh accent. They may be able to identify certain people, as I identified, like Emma Watson. For me, there's a good example of a person who has what sounds to my American ear as like an extremely posh accent. Obviously, the King of England, to me, sounds like they have a posh accent, and so that those are to me the good examples. I know I listened to a recording before I recorded this of Tom Hiddleston, the actor, speaking just in his normal accent. And his normal accent is also seemingly very, very posh. And it can be from just, obviously, if you're the King of England, you get your posh accent, one way. And if you're someone who is not the King of England, odds are you probably got it from going to a school that was very well, another word for posh, fancy. And so that means, maybe you went to what is called in British English a public school. So, American English, those are run by governments. I guess in British English you'd call them a state school. For in U.S. English, that's what we call public schools. But in British English, public schools are the very, very fanciest, the poshest, if you will, private schools like Eton, for example. Now, if you go to a school like that, or if you didn't go to a fancy public school, but you went to, say, Oxford or Cambridge, maybe other places as well, you might also have a better chance of sounding posh. So that, to me, that's my understanding as an outsider to the whole system of posh. And as I said, in American English, I think we would be hard pressed to say what's a posh accent. We might just come up with like accents that sound like British English accents, then we'd say, "Oh, that's very posh," because I think that's all we have to reference posh. So those could be any of the the dialects of English in the Northeast that don't pronounce R's, the kind of, highfalutin accents. See, I apologize to Merriam-Webster. I agree. It's a highfalutin because for Americans, U.S. Americans, the idea of highfalutin is putting on kind of airs, since that's not necessarily baked into it's not baked into the kind of social structure. So it's hard, I think, for U.S. Americans to understand. It's not baked in the way that it's baked in the UK. So I think that's why we have to resort to words like highfalutin, because we're like, oh, that's what this person really sounds like. Oh, wow. I thought they just made up that accent. Okay, but let's get to the bottom of the word posh, because posh originally had nothing to do with accents. It also had nothing to do with restaurants or hotels. It had everything to do with clothing. Now, one of the first examples we have of someone defining the word posh is in 1897, and it's a dictionary of slang, jargon, and cant. Remember, on the episode about kayfabe, we talked about slang, jargon, cant, and all of these things, argot, and pigeon, and all of that stuff. Now, this dictionary embraces lots of different, as it claims, lots of different irregular phraseology, and from England, America, and also the South Asia. Importantly, for our discussion today, it focuses a lot, because one of the editors was an expert on the language of the Roma and the slang that entered into the speech of people who were not Roma and used words that were borrowed from what is sometimes referred to as Anglo-Romany, which Romany being the language of the Roma and Anglo-Romany being the English kind of based version of it. Now, there are several different Romany languages depending on where the speakers of the language are. And so this one is highly influenced by the English language, and also vice versa. The English language is highly influenced by Romany words. And one of these words, according to this dictionary in 1897, is the word posh. Now, posh in Romany means half. And what it is defined as in this dictionary of slang and jargon is as the modern term for money. And the reason that it comes from Romany is because the Romany word for a coin whose value is half of a penny, or it's called in British English a halfpenny, but it's spelled halfpenny. That word in Romany is poshero, which means half a copper or half a penny. So then after defining posh as a slang word for money, this dictionary entry goes on to talk about posh and posh, which is a Romany slang term for someone who is half Romany and half something else. And so that is followed by the kind of throwaway comment at the end of the dictionary entry. It says, also a dandy. All right, now that's important. That last part, also a dandy, that is our key to the early beginnings of posh, because that word dandy, for someone who cares a lot about their dress and clothing and how that all comes together into the way that they look and act, that idea is really the earliest meaning of posh in the sense that we talk about it today across the board. It has to do with clothing. Fast forward to 1914, where we have an example of the word posh being used that clarifies exactly how one person or group of people view the word and what kind of specifically it refers to. This example comes from a book, The British Army from Within, written by the extremely poshly named Evelyn Charles Vivian. The Evelyn Charles Vivian, not only did he had 3 first names, so I don't think you get posher than that. Now, in this book, Vivian talks about the idea of posh in regard to the cavalry. And I'll read this to you, not in a posh accent. The cavalryman, I don't think you could read cavalryman and not have a posh accent, but there's more. The cavalryman, far more than the infantryman, makes a point of wearing, quote, posh, unquote, clothing on every possible occasion. Posh being a term used to designate superior clothing or articles of attire other than those issued by and strictly conforming to the regulations. For walking out in town, a business commonly known as square pushing, the cavalryman who fancies himself will be found in superfine cloth overalls, wearing nickel spurs instead of the regulation steel pair, and with light, thin-soled boots instead of the Wellingtons with which he is issued. It is a commonplace among the infantry that a cavalryman spends half his pay and more on posh clothing, but probably the accusation is a little unjust. Okay, that's the end of the passage from Evelyn Charles Vivian's book on the British Army from Within. Now, notice that posh is an adjective that refers specifically to clothing. So it's called posh clothing. In this case, it's not the individual who is being described as posh, but the individual's clothing. Now, why am I making such a big deal about clothing here? I'll tell you why. And the answer is a lingua franca of South Asia that was of intense interest in the 18th and 19th century to British authors who were writing books about language and dictionaries and multilingual dictionaries because of the East India Company and their increasing control in the region of South Asia. And as was the case with the cataloging of things in the languages of the Philippines that happened after the Spanish-American War in English language sources, so there became an intense interest in the cataloging of the languages of the area, especially the language that was the lingua franca, which was the language known as Hindustani. Now, Hindustani is, well, it's maybe easier for me to explain it by saying that if you think of Hindi, the modern language Hindi, as a standardized version of Hindustani, that might be helpful. It's written in the script, the old script of Sanskrit, which is called Devanagari, and that's the Hindi language. And there is the Urdu language, which is a standardized version of Hindustani with a lot more Persian vocabulary and written in a changed version of the Persian script, which itself is a version of ultimately of Arabic script. So that was borrowed from the Arabic language, the script that Arabic language was written in, or it still is written in. So that might help with thinking about what Hindustani is. And so these were dictionaries that had lots of terms in the various language versions of Hindustani, whether they be ones that were related to what is called the Deccan Plateau, which is in modern-day India, or whether they were elsewhere. But this is the focus of a lot of dictionaries. And they have the words that are Persian script, like the that are either Urdu. They have those, and they have words that are the Sanskrit script, the Devanagari, like in Hindi. So in these dictionaries, you'll see two script, well, three, because you'll see the Latin script that English is written in. But so they're written in those two different scripts, and they have lots of definitions for words. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. And this is something that doesn't get said about the word posh, is that the word posh, coming from the Persian strain of language in Hindustani, the word posh has to do with wearing, covering, clothing. And that's what posh means. So if you're talking about shoes and you're using the vocabulary word that's coming from the Persian strain that's present in Hindustani, then you might call them paposh, foot coverings. And the same thing goes with a hat, the head covering. This is clearly coming from the Persian. It's only written in the Persian script in the dictionary. It's clear that in the Devanagari script that this is not a word that was put into that script. So this is coming from that Persian tradition that you see in Hindustani. And the word posh for things to do with clothing even extends to the person wearing the clothing in the case of some of the earliest dictionaries in 1790, without saying what exactly is meant. The author of that dictionary, Henry Harris, says that one of the words, poshaki, which has that word posh in it, poshaki, means a fop, which is another word in English for dandy. And so that is interesting because we already have a connection to the dandy meaning of posh, poshaki, in the early Hindustani English dictionaries. Now, it's kind of interesting because Romani and languages like Persian and the languages related to Hindustani as well apparently are related. That's the thought, is that ultimately somehow it's a relative of these languages. Now it's not saying it necessarily comes from those places, but the languages that are connected to those languages, it seems to be in there somewhere. And that's because the number system very much like overlaps for the most part with languages some of the languages of South Asia that are related to all of the languages I'm talking about today. But interestingly, the numbers 7, 8, 9 are Greek in Romany. So that's interesting. And that has to do with the presence of Roma in the Balkans at early time periods where they are also speakers of Greek. But that is maintained in kind of some of the languages the Romani speak. Now, the word for half is not posh in these particular languages, as it is in the Anglo-Romani, as we saw in that dictionary from the 1890s as well. Okay, so here's what is most interesting to me about this possible, I'll say, Hindustani connection to the word posh in British cavalrymen's vocabulary. In a dictionary from 1859, a word poshak is defined as clothing, especially costly ones. So here we have, again, the posh word for covering, wearing, etc., clothing, alluding to expensive clothing as poshak. This is in a Hindustani English dictionary from 1859. So again, we have a clear connection in that tradition, in that Hindustani tradition, of posh and poshak relating not only just to covering, wearing garments, clothing, but also maybe finer clothing, which then when you look back at the writings of the British Army officer from 1914 about the cavalrymen wearing posh clothing, you can see how this may have been borrowed from that language world. So I want to add that to our understanding of the word posh and where it comes from. And posh definitely had some help from the phrase a square pusher, because there are words that are used in various dialects in England that relate to pulping something or really, beating it. That is called poshing or posh. And there's also some dialectical versions of push that are posh. So I have a feeling that in that square pusher discussion in that 1914 treatise on the British Army from within, that the pusher part of the square pusher might have had to do with the transference of posh from the clothing to the actual person, because there's an earlier dictionary, it's talking about young women being square pushers, and this is very much the equivalent of the cavalrymen that we were talking about. And so that may have also had some influence on solidifying this whole identity around posh. Let's ask the cards how we could be a little bit more posh in our lives and work. So here we go. Yellow lemon, blue dumpling, magenta noodles. Cards, tell us something. Oh, it's card 44. Map your knowledge. To be licensed, London cab drivers need to know pretty much every twist and turn of the city. Well, this is so fitting that this is about London. Cards, you always come through in the clutch. This learning is called the knowledge. So now today, start to create your own personal knowledge and think about where you are or where you want to be and how that location matches up with your aspirations for yourself. So Think about that today. Think about the specific locations where you are or where you want to be that resonate with your identity and your aspirations, and then find new ways to act on this knowledge. And I'll see you tomorrow on Life's Potluck Buffet.